Welcome back. I am here to announce that episodes 1 and 2 of The Rings of Power are, regrettably, in my humble opinion, the best episodes of season 1, with the possible exception of the last episode. I made a video reviewing the first 2 episodes immediately after watching them, not even pausing to sleep on it, and then I took a hiatus to allow the story to find its shape. At the time of that first review, I was cautiously optimistic. The first 2 episodes were slow, very slow, but they laid a foundation for what I hoped would be decent corporate fan fiction set in Middle-earth. My expectations were not that high. I knew that the show was not going to satisfy Tolkien purists, and that it would betray the lore, but I thought that it could be a good fantasy show that did its best to not muck up what Tolkien had committed to paper. Unfortunately, The Rings of Power fails in this respect. It hits some high notes for a generic fantasy show, which less discerning audiences will no doubt enjoy, but it is an abysmal butchery of Tolkien lore, and it also suffers from numerous flaws in logical writing and production choices, which I am going to explain. I wanted to wait until the entire first season was out to review this show because endings can have an impact. I will say that the last episode of The Rings of Power is more interesting than the middle episodes, but more interesting doesn't make up for unlikable characters, poor story logic, at least in places, some cringy dialogue, and totally rewriting the lore it is supposed to be based on. Yes, there is a twist, sort of. And there are some dramatic visuals, and we finally get to see some rings. But the story presented is completely wrong from what Tolkien tells us about the forging of the Rings of Power, and what they did instead is certainly not a better story than what Tolkien wrote, even in summary of this era. For this reason, I do think Tolkien would have hated this show, and so would his son. But Amazon didn't produce The Rings of Power to satisfy the Tolkien estate. I am not actually sure who they intended the audience to be. At times it seems to assume you have knowledge of things that are explained in the Silmarillion and other extended texts from the Lord of the Rings, and at other times it spits on the lore. I think The Rings of Power is mostly made for audience who have never read any of the books and just like fantasy shows and want to see more stories set in Middle-earth because they like the Peter Jackson films. I also have to say that articles released by the press to explain and justify the decisions made by this show are hilarious. There are so many articles that you have to read just to understand what is going on, as well as a bunch of self-congratulations from the show producers coming out of the mouths of journalists, I assume through interviews or issued press releases. That's kind of standard PR stuff though, so there's no point really in mocking it. True fans of Tolkien aren't fooled, of course, but what interests me are the casual viewers. Enough of them are disappointed that I do think Amazon Prime Studios is a bit concerned about the show's perception. Much like The Wheel of Time, audiences are divided on whether The Rings of Power is watchable. Before we go any further, I want to make clear that I am not an alt-right troll trying to convince moderates that a woke liberal agenda is ruining their beloved hobbies. I am also not an internet influencer peddling outrage for clicks, which should be obvious by the lack of production quality in this video. I am just a reader and writer of fantasy. I am also a liberal voter. I was not bothered at all by the casting choices for this show. And after watching the whole of season 1, I don't think it has any particularly woke messages. I actually think that a lack of messaging and meaningful themes contributes to why The Rings of Power is kind of boring. I do have one piece of political commentary, though, before we dive into the reviews, and that is to acknowledge that Tolkien's Legendarium is not particularly fertile ground for feminism, if some sort of feminist message was the intent of The Rings of Power. I say this with complete understanding that Tolkien wrote some pretty strong female characters for his time. Luthien is one of few characters to get the better of Morgoth, and Galadriel is accounted one of the wise. Arwen, who marries Aragorn, is descended from them both. Eowyn is also an interesting character with a quasi-feminist storyline depending on how you interpret it. All of this being said, Tolkien's world is sexist, and many Tolkien fans are also sexist. Here is a quote from an article in The Spectator. Tolkien didn't underwrite his female characters because he was a sexist pig. He did so because he was writing about heroic quests, and heroic quests are, and always have been until recently, and with good reason, undertaken by men. It goes on to talk about how, in Tolkien's Christian worldview, empowered women would be symptomatic of civilization in its death throes. It then goes on to quote Elon Musk as some sort of authority on this subject, because of course it does. This is a revolting perspective of women. It is a sexist perspective, but it's not altogether wrong about Tolkien's view. I personally would not describe Tolkien as a sexist pig, but he was strongly Catholic, and I would ascribe sexism to him as I would most men of his time. Tolkien believed that women and men could not be friends, and that women were inherently less than men, incapable of heroism or even of intellect, except in rare cases or when driven to extraordinary heights by love. If you don't believe me, here is a quote from one of his letters written to his son in 1941. Under this impulse of love, women can in fact often achieve very remarkable insight and understanding, even of things otherwise outside of their natural range. For it is their gift to be receptive, stimulated, fertilized, in many other matters than the physical, by the male. Every teacher knows that, how quickly an intelligent woman can be taught, grasp his ideas, see his point, and how, with rare exceptions, they can go no further when they leave his hand or when they cease to take a personal interest in him. J.R.R. Tolkien, Letter to His Son, number 43, on Marriage and Relations Between the Sexes, 1941. So, there you have it. According to Tolkien, women are primarily receptacles for the greatness of men, and can, at times, reflect men's greatness in service of loving men. Afterward, they are doomed to disappear, as Luthien does after besting Morgoth by becoming a mortal and dying for her love of Beren, rather than, supplanting her father to become the ruling queen of the elves. It's just her nature. According to Tolkien, when women attempt to aspire to great deeds reserved for men, they are miserable, like Eowyn, who was extremely unhappy until she gives up being a shield maiden to marry Faramir and takes up healing. Naturally womanly pursuits. In his letter to his son, Tolkien goes on and on about how women yearn only to become mothers and are inherently monogamous, while Christian men must work at being faithful to their wives as a kind of sacrifice to God. For those of you who might be shocked by this, especially if you idolize Tolkien from a modern lens, please keep in mind that I like Tolkien, but he is a product of his time and religion. Moreover, it is a bad idea to idolize humans in general. They will disappoint you. That doesn't mean that Tolkien is not a creative genius. He is. His work defined a genre, which I love. And I think he was a truly good person. But he's not a perfect human being who is wise in all matters. No one is. And I only bring up Tolkien's views on women to demonstrate that the impulse Amazon Prime Studios had to pull Middle-earth out of its sexist perspective should be met with at least a willingness to see if it can work. Unfortunately, Rings of Power does not do a good job of it. It's not bad because of Mordred Clark either, who plays Galadriel. The character of Galadriel has problems, and we'll take a look at those now that I know what the studio ultimately chose to do with her character, but it annoys the shit out of me when I see scathing negative reviews of some movie or TV show equated with a giant image of a real woman's face and commentary that focuses on picking apart the actress. Morfred Clark didn't write this interpretation of Galadriel. I am also still pissed off about how Brie Larson was, and continues to be, lambasted for playing Captain Marvel, a powerful female superhero in a franchise that frankly lacked one. I could do a whole video on the blatant misogyny revealed by that spectacularly stupid controversy. But let's move on from this topic, because unlike Marvel's recent installments, I honestly don't think The Rings of Power has any greatly insightful commentary on feminism or any other woke subject. It doesn't have anything interesting to say about race either, or about the nature of good and evil, except in the most simplistic and banal terms. This brings me back to the point. The biggest problem with The Rings of Power is the writing. What it demonstrates, at least to me, is that television scriptwriters do not have the skill to create in weeks or months what novelists spend decades or a lifetime to produce. There is a reason many scriptwriters are considered hacks in publishing. It's not universally true, as there are many amazing TV shows written and produced by exceptional writers, especially lately, but Rings of Power is not one of them. Rings of Power is, at best, trite fantasy. It feels almost contemptuous of its subject matter at times, and I can see why people wonder if the show was produced as a means to launder money. I am not an expert in TV production, but even I can see that the sets and costumes look like something created for the stage. There are times when it feels like the actors are trapped inside a painting. The designs are nice, it looks beautiful, but something about the materials used, or the lighting, or the way it is filmed, or treated afterwards, makes the sets look like sets. Other than those wide panning cinematic shots that we get in the opening episodes, Middle-earth feels very small and unpopulated in The Rings of Power. This is exacerbated when a lot of traveling, the adventure part of the story, is cut out of the actual filming. The main actors are just moving from set to set in a handful of reused locations that feel too close together. I feel the camera, particularly when they add lens flares or show drops of water on the lens, which happens often enough to feel intentional and is just baffling. Despite these problems and some of the deeper problems that I am going to get into in this overly long video, the show is not a total travesty. It doesn't deserve its 80-something% fresh tomato score from critics. No idea how much of the show they actually watched, but it also doesn't deserve the 30-something rotten score from audiences. It is a flawed show with poor pacing and some bad story logic, but it's not utter dreck. I like some of the characters, some of the conflicts, and some of the scenes. Elendil is a highlight for me. He actually feels like he belongs in this world, despite being a side character in this season. I also like the scenes with Durin and Disa and Elrond's friendship with the dwarves in general. I also have to say that even with all of the logic problems, none of the episodes in The Rings of Power are as bad as those last few episodes in the Wheel of Time's first season. However, The Rings of Power is being held to a high standard for fantasy because it's depicting Middle-earth. It is scoring, therefore, lower because expectations were so high. In respect to Tolkien and the lore it is intending to adapt, the 30-something audience response may be too high. In fact, I think it is too high. But if you ignore the lore and score the watchability of the show against other shows holistically, or fantasy shows in particular, I would rank it somewhere in the middle, maybe popping up to 60-something, even 70-something if you are particularly impressed by some of the visuals that the show conveys. For my standards, though, in terms of the writing, I knew this show was veering toward bad by episode 5, and I was certain it couldn't be saved by episode 6. This is really unfortunate because I wanted to like the Rings of Power. I wanted the show to be good. I wanted to enjoy the next 4 seasons. I really did. But it's just not. Similar to the Wheel of Time's shaky first season, episode 6 was a turning point for me. Episode 6 is supposed to be the revelatory episode where the villain's plot is revealed and the stakes are raised, and it has an epically explosive ending with Mount Doom erupting and the land of Mordor being formed. It is epic, but it didn't resonate with me because I found the writing for how we got there and what happened after to be painful and illogical. Up until this point, the Rings of Power undulates between tedium and melodrama. The plot progresses at a speed that feels glacial at times, and then rushes through the resolutions of its conflicts. Some episodes feel interminably long, like I had to pause some of them in the middle to see how much more there was to go because I couldn't believe I was still watching the same episode. All the dead space is filled with characters either bickering about disagreements that fall just short of character development, or bolstering each other up with sermons about how brave and resilient and heroic they are in the face of darkness, despite no character doing anything particularly brave or heroic, except maybe Arendir, who doesn't get any credit for it. The dialogue is not cringe-inducing in the way I feared it might be, meaning the actual words sound okay most of the time, but it's maddening how banal, repetitive, and unearned some of these speeches are. And why is this? Well, it's because instead of writing a story about people overcoming conflicts that threaten them or the achievement of their goals in ways that feel natural, this show shepherds its cast into this predetermined mold that is part half-baked mystery and part over-engineered battle sequences that are intended to rhyme with The Lord of the Rings. And you know where I'm going here. In more ways than one, The Rings of Power suffers from the same problems as Star Wars, The Phantom Menace. Both stories suffer from a convoluted, nonsensical plot and undeveloped characters and themes, but distract you from these shortcomings with pretty scenery, occasionally interesting costumes, and flashy fight sequences. If what you care about is fantastical places and epic orc battles, Rings of Power is a fine show. It's fine. If you care about actual storytelling, though, and particularly logical storytelling and characters that you care about as an audience, you probably watch the show with a feeling of dismay, but you may be unable to put your finger on exactly what is wrong with it. Well, I'm here to enlighten you. Let's talk about the 4 parts of story in relation to the Rings of Power: plot, character, setting, and theme. Let's start with plot. What is the plot of the Rings of Power? This is a hard question to answer. Based on the title, I assume that the plot would relate to, the Rings of Power. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky, 7 for the Dwarf Lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. I thought the story would introduce us to Sauron, non-mysteriously, in his fair but false guise Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and show us how he convinces the elven smiths to create many magical rings of power, 20 of the most powerful being under the control secretly of the One Ring. I thought Gil-galad, Elrond, and Galadriel would be suspicious, but Celebrimbor would be susceptible up to a point. I thought the dwarf Thrain Durin would be gifted, or already have, one of these rings, which would explain his cantankerous relationship with his son, who should not also be named Durin, and increase his greed and desire to dig deep for Mithril, in spite of the danger it poses to his people, albeit from dragons, not mining accidents. I thought it would be explained that the wizard was sent to Middle-earth by the Valar to bring revelations of Sauron's trickery, but becomes confused when being made into an incarnate being. I thought Nori the Harfoot would help him remember his mission, learn to communicate his wisdom, and be his guide through the physical dangers of Middle-earth to warn the elves and men. I expected Galadriel to play a bigger role than in the books by gathering enough evidence to convince the elves to take off the rings they had made with Sauron's help before he can hijack their thoughts and turn them against each other. I expected for the first season to end with the unmasking of Sauron, and then Sauron bringing war to the elves to take his rings back. I thought Numenor would be a side story, to be developed more in a later season, when Sauron turns his attention to corrupting men with the rings he recovers. But Amazon's The Rings of Power takes no notes from Tolkien's summary of the story, at least not in the first season, and it's hard to see how they will return to the original source material given the changes that were made in season 1. Instead of a story about how evil donned a fair face and smooth speech to corrupt fair folk, Amazon wrote a mystery plot around who or where Sauron is, but without really committing to a workable mystery template. The result is that the audience is just sort of confused about what they are watching. The clues are really obvious, interminably spaced out, and anticlimactic when solved. I also have to point out that Amazon's Wheel of Time adaptation adopted this same plot structure, only with the mystery applied to the protagonist, Moiraine, and who is the dragon, despite that also not being the plot of the Wheel of Time books. I have to wonder if showrunner Rafe Judkins blatantly plagiarized The Rings of Power when he got a glimpse of the script, thinking it could be a big hit and thought that no one would notice. But I digress. The plot of season 1 also struggles because it has to develop 4 separate storylines which do not all converge in 8 episodes. First, we have Galadriel, who is our detective in this boring mystery. She alone of all the elves, for some reason, believes that Sauron has not been defeated. Her mission is to find evidence of Sauron's whereabouts and garner support to stop his plans, whatever they are. Galadriel is prevented from achieving her mission by a series of unfortunate events and aided by a series of coincidences. First, the elves stop believing in her quest, and her own soldiers abandon her, their commander. Gil-galad tries to send her away to Valinor, but she refuses, an act of defiance which sees her lost at sea with no clear way home. But by coincidence, she meets Halbrand. Also, by coincidence, she ends up in Numenor, where she makes some key discoveries that point her to the Southlands. While all this is going on, we are introduced to Isildur and a made-up character to play his sister, who is in the story for some reason, even though neither of them do that much. Isildur is introduced to be bad at his job and a disappointment to his father. He hears voices that are never explained and gets himself and his friends thrown out of the Navy by making a mistake that appears to be on a training expedition where you would think mistakes would be acceptable. Later, he tries to stow away on a ship and ends up covering up another character's attempt at arson, which is supposed to make us like him, but which I found to be out of character and completely nonsensical. But again, I digress. The main story is about Galadriel, and despite being disrespectful to everyone who saves her life, Galadriel forms an alliance with Elendil and Tarmariel, the queen of the Númenóreans, and convinces them to sail to Middle-earth along with Halbrand to stop Sauron and save the men of the Southlands. I'll come back to this plot. Second, we have Meteor Man, who I still hope to be a blue wizard and not Gandalf, falling to Middle-earth and landing among the Harfoots. This was initially intriguing, but in 7 episodes, we learn little about him or what he is there to do. The Harfoots are initially a breath of fresh air against all the other serious plot lines, but their storyline quickly becomes tedious when it becomes less about solving the mystery of a man who fell from the sky and can control fire, and instead focuses on the migration of these nomadic people from one meaningless location to another meaningless location. The only conflict is that the wizard keeps accidentally hurting the Harfoots and then helping the Harfoots, so they have to decide whether or not to keep him around. For added drama, Nori's dad hurts his foot. which means that Nori's whole family might be left behind if they can't keep up, which culturally makes no sense and feels like forced drama. A tribe of people this small would depend on every member, and you would think that they would have encountered minor injuries before, like sprained ankles. During the migration, the Harfoots go back and forth and accepting the wizard and not accepting the wizard without ever really seeming to be that curious about him, which is maddening to watch. In episode 7, they arrive at their destination, the Grove, to find their apple trees burned in one specific spot. It's seriously just 6 to 8 trees. It is a very small orchard that they have traveled all this way to find, but they are so upset about this one known source of food that the wizard tries to heal the trees, once again almost hurting the Harfoots on accident, after which he finally ambles off alone into the unknown. Of course, the magic ends up working, but none of the Harfoots go after the wizard to let him know all is forgiven. Instead, these witch characters show up. Who they are and what they want is a mystery, but they look scary, so Nori's father confronts them, which makes no sense from what we know about the Harfoots, since the whole basis of their culture is to run and hide from any perceived threat. The attempt at confrontation goes badly. The witches burn all of the Harfoots' wagons. Then Nori's father stands up and gives a rousing speech about how Harfoots are always there for each other, which is the opposite of the conflict of throwing stragglers out of the tribe that specifically targeted him up until this point. Then Nori decides to go after the wizard to warn him about the witches. The climax of the story is when the witches confront the wizard and tell him that they have come to serve him because they think that he is Sauron. This happens in episode 8. This scares the wizard because he is worried he might be evil based on having accidentally almost hurt the Harfoots repeatedly. It turns out, though, that the witches just misread the signs. They knew that Meteor Man could have been an Astari because they mention it, but believe he is Sauron for some reason until he tells them that he is good and attacks them. Collectively, this whole plotline feels like it could have been covered in a few scenes with way fewer Harfoot characters. Meanwhile, Elrond is sent by Gil-galad to aid Celebrimbor in making a great forge, which is needed by Spring for some reason. For this, he enlists the help of the dwarves, and particularly his friend Durin, Durin's son. This plotline then shifts from a story about a forge, which is built but entirely off camera, to a conflict involving Mithril and how Mithril can save the elves from losing their immortality because it holds the light of both the Silmarils and Balrogs. This whole subplot is hugely jarring because it is absolutely invented by Amazon Prime Studios. Not only is this not part of Tolkien's Legendarium, but it is antithetical thematically to the whole concept of the elves in Middle-earth. First, the Rings of Power does not bother to even explain what a Silmaril is. I'll tell you, they are holy relics of the elves that reflect the light of creation and were stolen by Morgoth. The Silmarils are the reason the elves leave Valinor, their version of Eden, and go to war with Morgoth in Middle-earth, for which they suffer for centuries. I can tell you that no Silmaril is randomly lost and then found in some random tree. Also, darkness should have no redeeming qualities to mix with the light of the Silmarils. In Tolkien's Legendarium, good comes from the gods and evil is empty. Mithril is a valuable metal, but nothing more than that. Introducing Mithril as being able to extend the lives of the elves means that the elves no longer need the Valar, their gods, as their salvation can be mined out of the earth. I want to remind everyone again that Tolkien was very religious. There is a lot of similarity in the mythology that he wrote for the elves and Christian mythology about angels and demons, the sin of pride and the fall of man, and redemption being only achievable through the grace of God. Moreover, Tolkien was very opposed to industry spoiling the natural world and was something of an environmentalist. This concept of Mithril replacing the grace of the Valar to save the elves from their doom is just I mean, I'm not personally religious, and this would have been an interesting concept in some other fantasy story, but it's offensive for Middle-earth. It also would totally change the dynamic between the elves and the dwarves. If Mithril contained the light of Asamariel, even without the immortality bit, it would be conceivable that the elves would wage a holy war with the dwarves to retrieve it. The sons of Fëanor would be oath-bound to do so. But even setting all of that aside, the conflict over Mithril in the Rings of Power is confusing even within the story that's structured just for TV. First, the dwarven Thrain is really excited about it. He's the one who shows it to his son. But then there's a mining accident, so mining Mithril is deemed too risky. Except that Durin's son, Durin, manages to do it easily working along with Elrond using like 2 pickaxes and some sweat equity. But with the veins and veins of Mithril unearthed and visible through a hole, and immensely valuable, remember immortality is on the table, the Dwarven King is inexplicably mad at his son and won't trade Mithril to the elves for anything. The option to find a way to make the mining safe, or to let the elves mine it themselves, taking on all the risk, is never discussed. The Mithril mining does awaken a Balrog, but that wasn't a known consequence and doesn't get resolved in this season. The whole conflict also makes Gil-galad look really shady since he lied to Elrond. His plan all along was to deceive the dwarves to obtain Mithril to save the elves. But then again, this urgency to equip all the elves with Mithril is later dropped as Celebrimbor only ends up making 3 rings out of the small quantity that Elrond has, and Gil-galad doesn't even get one. At least not in this season. Last but not least, we have the story of Arondir and his human love interest Bronwyn and her son Theo in the Southlands. The Southland villagers are being guarded by Sindar elves because they have old ties to Sauron and need to be kept under watch. An orc horde is tunneling underground, although where they are going is unclear. The orcs take the elves guarding the Southlanders captive to aid in their tunneling efforts, including Arondir. The orcs turn out to be led by an elf named Adar, who doesn't really get any character development until episode 7, but it turns out that he is an early captive of Morgoth who later joins Sauron's armies because he has become sympathetic to the orcs, although hostile to Sauron himself. Arondir is inexplicably let loose to bring a message to the human villagers. This doesn't make any sense, because Adar does not need the humans for his plan, and sending the humans an elf gives them their only solid warrior who ends up killing a lot of his orc children. Adar's ultimate plan is to create a homeland for the orcs. To accomplish this, he needs to set off a giant volcano to blot out the sun, which is harmful to the skin of orcs. To set off the volcano, he needs to procure a magical key sword-hilt MacGuffin thing, which can be found in the Southlander village, which I guess he knew was there somehow. It will fit into this old shrine, which is also nearby. When turned, it opens a dam. The dam floods the volcano through the tunnels that Adar's orcs have been digging. This plotline is supposed to be clever, but I found it deeply convoluted. Who built this overcomplicated mechanism? Sauron? When? Why? What was the intention of building it this way, where tunnels have to be built first? What if the key was used before the tunnels were built? What if it broke in the intervening years? Why is a key even needed? The dam looks like it could be manually triggered. Why does the key glow and cause burns on people's arms if all it does is unlock a dam? Is it a magical sword or just a device? Did the elves guarding this place for centuries never scout around the place to uncover this shrine and this dam mechanism? If they had no idea that any of this existed, why are they guarding it and these villagers who are not numerous or particularly threatening? How did Adar know about all of this? Let's pretend I can ignore all that, or that I missed something in the watching of the show. The fight between the orcs and the villagers, and later the Númenóreans, also makes no sense. The villagers are not that many. It's actually kind of amazing how much budget this show has and how small and inconsequential these people of the Southland seem. I liked the small story of Arondir and Bronwyn finding love in this poor village on the outskirts of nowhere, but I thought the Southlander story was going to evolve into a whole country of people at some point. When they are attacked by the orcs, I thought they were going to, I don't know, run away to some larger town or city with better fortifications. The orcs can't travel by daylight, and digging tunnels is a slow business. The villagers are also not trained warriors, nor do they have weapons, and they are burdened by children and elders. Their best bet for survival is to run. But instead, they leave their village for the small fort, which they booby-trap instead of fortify, and then go back to the village to hide in a tavern with a wooden door. I don't understand this plan. Moreover, if the orcs only really want the key, and the villagers know that the orcs want the key, Arondir, as their fastest individual, should have taken it and run, sending the villagers in another direction and hoping the hordes of orcs follow him instead of them. But no one does anything logical in this show. Instead, the writers are trying to maneuver the story into a siege scene like Helm's Deep, but worse, because they want to have a similar battle scene, even if it makes no sense for these poor, nearly starving, untrained, and untrustworthy people to put up any kind of a stand in this situation. Everything that happens just feels unnatural. Why does Bronwyn take up a leadership role and give a speech about how she's not the king the people were expecting? She's just a healer. How do they even know where the enemy is or how large the forces are? The fight scenes aren't even that interesting. Some of the choreography was okay, but some of it looked like stage fighting. Collapsing the tower looked really unbelievable, and using the flaming wagons also did not look believable, as they took way too much manual effort to be useful. It also made no sense for Bronwyn to save Arondir instead of the other way around. I did like the scene where she was stabbed and her wounds had to be cauterized, but I was confused why no one attacked the villagers during any of that. Like, there's the wooden door, just a single wooden door, between hordes of orcs and these wounded villagers, and during that scene, which is a long time for a battle, no one attacks. Arondir was frankly needed elsewhere, and Theo could have saved his mom without Arondir during that time. But of course, it's the Númenóreans who arrive to save the villagers, merging plotlines 1 and 4, which also makes no sense. How did Galadriel and the Númenóreans get there so fast? They're thousands and thousands of miles away, and even if these plotlines are moving at different speeds, and Galadriel's forces arrive coincidentally within a day's ride of this crisis, how did they know it was happening or where? Like, did they disembark from their ships and just ride as hard as they could inland, hoping to run into a horde of orcs attacking a village? I don't know. I know the king of the Southlanders is with them, but he could not have known that this exact conflict was happening in this specific place, and would not have told them based on what we learn about him later. If anything, the Sindar elves would have been the best source of information since they have a garrison in the area, which makes me wonder why no one has checked on all those Sindar elves who were captured and murdered. Like, does anyone care about them? The sequence of events just felt so clumsy in its logic, it's hard to take that whole conflict seriously. But you know, once the Númenóreans arrive, it's an easy win, right? Adar wasn't expecting that, but then murdering a handful of villagers wasn't really his ambition. What he wanted was the key. Theo gives it up when Adar threatens his mother, but they get it back when the Númenóreans arrive. Except they don't. But no one notices until too late, because Arondir didn't think to check why a pickaxe feels different wrapped in a sack than a sword hilt. While the key is being used to open the dam, Galadriel stops Halbrand from trying to kill Adar so she can question him. Then she tries to murder him herself, and Halbrand stops her. This is because Adar reveals his sympathies for the orcs, and Galadriel becomes enraged that an elf would stoop to this level of treachery. As a side note, I do find Adara to be an interesting character, but this whole conversation would have been more interesting in a different fantasy series. The orcs are morally problematic in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Even Tolkien himself couldn't settle on an origin story for them because he wanted the orcs to be irredeemably evil and for it therefore to be morally uncompromising to slay them with abandon, but struggled to figure out how they were created if evil cannot create. For this reason, the moral question of, are orcs people too, is a question better left unasked. In another fantasy setting, I would applaud the introduction of moral complexity, but Tolkien's Middle-earth is sort of known for avoiding moral complexity. It is a fantasy in part because of how unequivocal the notions of good and evil are in this world. Posing this question of whether the orcs deserve sympathy made audiences kind of like Adar and made Galadriel look even worse than she already did. She basically advocates for genocide in this conversation, and she's supposed to be the hero. But I digress. Let's get back to the explosive ending of this episode. Quite literally, this episode ends with the volcano erupting. A pyroclastic flow descends on the village, and it looks spectacular. Everyone in its wake is instantly fried in temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, soft tissue like eyes evaporating, bodies mummifying, and brain matter turning into glass. Oh wait, no. Episode 7 assures us that all you have to do when a volcano erupts is kneel and brace for impact. Almost everyone with a name is actually fine. There's a lot of ash and it's kind of red and murky, but no one is choking or boiling alive in their metal armor or has any broken bones or anything. It's a bit of a bother finding survivors, but they just wander toward their encampment where the air is clear, as it's known to do within walking distance of a fiery apocalypse. Queen Tarmiriel is blind, but she's pretty optimistic about the importance of continuing the fight against the orcs in the Southlands, despite having no obligation to defend these people whatsoever and needing to immediately limp back to Numenor first, which again is thousands of miles away. Galadriel thinks she'd better move on and inform the elves, though. No apologies in any direction. Thanks for the ride to the mainland, guys. Sorry you suffered so many casualties for nothing. Seriously though, the visuals for this scene were arresting, and I don't hate the concept of Mount Doom going off in this show. I just wish someone writing this script had done a little research on just how far away you would have to be to survive a volcano eruption of this magnitude. Pompeii is a good example. I've been there. The town with the mummified bodies was buried in 25 kilometers of ash and debris to be unearthed hundreds of years later. If the script had been written differently, by which I mean believably, everyone could be fleeing on the ships days before the mountain actually erupted, which would have carried the same effect without being completely unbelievable. Or the mountain could have exploded in a different direction than the town because of the wind, or the town could have been spared somewhat by Galadriel using her magic, if that, existed in the story. Anyway, episode 7 ends with Adar renaming the land. There's an implication that the ash from the volcano will be continuously belched to create a sky that is murky enough to allow the orcs to live above ground, which was Adar's intention all along. The words on the screen telling us that this is Mordor was completely unnecessary, but in case you didn't get it. Last, we have episode 8, which is about the unmasking of Sauron. There is an initial fake out that it might be the wizard, which I already covered, but it turns out to be Halbrand. To me, this was disappointing. I was hoping that Halbrand was going to be one of the 9 mortal men doomed to die, maybe the Witch King, but as soon as he started showing an interest in the smithy in Numenor, I was like, oh, maybe he's Sauron after all. But before we get into that, let's talk about the characters. There are too many characters in the Rings of Power to cover all of them in the time I want to spend on this video. Suffice it to say that none of them feel like they are in character for Middle-earth except for Elendil, and he doesn't do that much. Elrond is a likable character to me, despite not really feeling like Elrond. Durin and Disa are also likable characters, despite not being canon characters in this timeline. I like Arendir and Bronwyn, okay, as completely made up characters, but not all of their conflicts. And Adar is an interesting villain with some good monologues. I also like Nori and Poppy and the wizard when we see him do anything. But that's it, and the praise is pretty shallow because the writing doesn't develop any of these people in any meaningful way. And they are surrounded by idiots. Bronwyn's son Theo is a mouth breather, Isildur is a privileged slacker who is rightfully demoted to stablehand, but then leads the charge to save the Southlanders for some reason. The Queen Tarmiriel has no real personality that I can name, except to say that she is queenly. Durin's father, the Thrain, is incalcitrant for no reason. Gilgalad is a deceiver. Celebrimbor has no defining qualities that I can point out. Nori's parents are irritating, and most of the Harfoots are entirely unnecessary for the story. None of this is the fault of the actors. It's the fault of a shallow script. But the worst character by far is Galadriel, and this pains me to say because Galadriel is a great character in The Lord of the Rings as written by Tolkien. Galadriel is the only character with a backstory, the one that we are supposed to connect to the most, the main character. But although her costumes and hair are pretty to look at, her story doesn't make me like her. I don't really care about her brother, never mind that she should have more than one, and I don't get why her thirst for revenge would be more honed than any other elf's. I've said before and I'll say again that the problem isn't that Galadriel wears armor or is shown to use a sword. It's not even that she's really good at those things. She's over 3,000 years old. She can have mastery in many skills. But this portrayal of Galadriel does not feel anything like the character we are introduced to in Lord of the Rings, or that we know from her description or doings in the Legendarium. In the books, Galadriel is wiser than the other elves. Spiritually, she is supposed to be incorruptible. She exercises caution when other elves are hot-headed. She sees through Sauron's deceits. She forms the Council of the Wise. She studies magic with Melian and should be at least as powerful as the wizards. Galadriel may have commanded armies we just never knew about, but she is not a commander in a career sense. And yet this fact about her is stated repeatedly in the Rings of Power, like she rose through the ranks of a regimented military instead of being a member of a noble house who commands just by being Galadriel. The Rings of Power makes Galadriel's vengeance and military experience her only character trait, and it's just wrong. Departure from the lore aside, she is just not a likable person, and she doesn't improve upon deeper acquaintance, either through flashbacks or through events that shape her character and change her throughout the story. The piss and vinegar character presented to us in episode 1 is the same character at the end of the first season. She shows only mild contrition and only to get what she wants or to avoid admonishment. She's also revealed to be the reason that Sauron is able to rise to power again. What are the writers of this show going for here? No one watching this version of Galadriel making catastrophic mistake after catastrophic mistake wants to imitate Galadriel. She is not a heroine. Does Galadriel even have magical abilities in this version of the story? It doesn't seem like it. And I don't know how they're going to resolve this, as Galadriel's magic is crucial to her being able to rule Lothlorien and hold her own against Sauron once he does reclaim his power. My guess is that they will attribute her magic to the ring that she gets at the end of season 1, but that would be deeply annoying because it would lessen Galadriel considerably and also show that she did what she did at the end of this season for the power, which again is just wrong. The rings in the books are also under the control of the One Ring, or they should be, which means that they cannot stave off Sauron's will. The rings do have some independent powers, but they're kind of nebulous. Like there is an indication that the Red Ring can stave off weariness and kindle hope, but it is not the source of Gandalf's power. Galadriel's ring might aid her preservation of Lothlorien, but is also not the source of her magic. The rings have limited use as long as Sauron has the One Ring. In the books, Galadriel is supposed to already have lands of her own. She's also supposed to be married to Celeborn and staying out of the conflicts of the elves. In the Rings of Power TV show, Galadriel thinks that Celeborn is dead, but she says this kind of offhandedly. Celeborn cannot really be dead because Galadriel needs to have a daughter to marry Elrond to produce Arwen. The point of pretending that Celeborn is dead seems to be so that Galadriel could maybe secretly entertain a love story with Halbrand, just to make his betrayal that more poignant at the end. I guess. But this is so stupid. Sauron does not have a wife and does not need one. He would never share power with anyone, ever. And Galadriel would never marry again. Elves just don't do that. I really didn't want Halbrand to be Sauron. I really dislike how non-committal the writers are at characterizing him because they don't want you to guess that he is Sauron. Halbrand is milquetoast. He's vaguely roguish. His evil is passive, with the threat of a prankster taking it too far. He is not Sauron levels of evil. He says he almost gave up and that Galadriel saved him. This was supposed to make you gasp because his rise then becomes her fault, but I just wanted to roll my eyes. Sauron is supposed to be an immortal, angelic being who can shapeshift and is a master of the art of deceit. He should be silver-tongued, fair-seeming, and absolutely bent on world domination. He should be kindling pride and greed and envy in the hearts of everyone he attempts to corrupt with his will. He should not be dressed in rags, but impressive in every way, almost pathologically concerned about his image like most narcissists. Instead, he's kind of a relaxed opportunist. He doesn't have to do anything to persuade Galadriel to go to war in the Southlands. She was already on a myopic path of vengeance. And Galadriel is worse than Sauron in some ways because she doesn't even tell the elves about her discovery. She's more worried about how she will look to them having been deceived into being Sauron's unwitting ally than to tell Gil-galad and Elrond and Celebrimbor who Sauron is despite the risk that he poses. This is so maddening and adds yet another stroke to the Galadriel as an unlikable character scorecard. She then manipulates Celebrimbor into making 3 rings instead of 2 after knowing that Sauron was to corrupt them, seemingly so she can take one for herself. So again, just for the record, in the books, Galadriel is a queen, incorruptible and undeceived, with powerful magic and accounted one of the wise, who is also one of the only elves powerful enough to stand against Sauron. In the show, Galadriel is a pissy, vengeful commander whose own soldiers abandon her, who annoys Gil-galad and Elrond, and who unwittingly allies herself with Sauron, the very enemy she sought to bring down, and then lies about it by omission to get herself a magical ring that is unsafe to use. You could very easily make the argument that Galadriel should just not have been the protagonist in the story, that a made-up elf would have served better. Even Galadriel's daughter could have been an interesting choice, since we don't know when she was born, and then you could have a love story with Elrond and have Galadriel in the story as a side character. I mean, that has its own problems, but almost anything would have been better than this character assassination of Galadriel. It is worth pointing out that the problems with character development in Rings of Power may not entirely be Amazon's fault. Character development isn't really Tolkien's thing either. There is a reason Lord of the Rings is a commercial success, and the Silmarillion barely made it to publication. Lord of the Rings makes its protagonists hobbits. Hobbits are relatable. They're ordinary country folk who like to eat and smoke and be lazy, and are largely ignorant of the worldly affairs. Highbrow characters like Elrond and Gil-galad and Galadriel are not very relatable. These characters do not change over the course of thousands of years. They might change their alliances and be discouraged by losses, but they don't really evolve as people in interesting and complex ways. This is partly why it's so easy to divide good from evil in Tolkien's world, because everyone is unchanging and firmly and permanently on the side of good or evil, regardless of what they do. It's part of what defines the high fantasy genre. Rings of Power choosing these characters as protagonists makes it almost impossible to tell the kind of story the writers seem most interested in telling in this particular setting, a story where characters grow and change. They try to make these characters relatable by giving them flaws, but instead just make them unlikable. As mentioned, the Rings of Power TV show also muddies the black and white of Tolkien's Middle-earth by introducing gray characters like Adar and trying to make us feel sympathy for the orcs. This doesn't work because the orcs exist to get slaughtered by the good guys, and we clearly aren't supposed to care when that happens. And this brings me to themes. What is the meaning of good and evil in the Rings of Power? That is supposedly the theme, but I honestly can't answer the question in this reimagining of Middle-earth. Both Adar and Sauron make some pretty compelling points that Galadriel isn't really as good as she thinks she is. Gil-galad is supposedly the noblest of elves, the High King, but he's the one who deceives Elrond and the dwarves in this bid to extend immortality of the elves in defiance of their gods. The wizard has to learn about good and evil from a Harfoot with no world experience, and then announces that he is good by hurting the witches. The Rings of Power may think that it is introducing nuance into Middle-earth, but it's really just spouting platitudes and meandering in circles. Middle-earth is a land built for adventure and fellowship and heroism. Unfortunately, the Rings of Power doesn't deliver on any of this. The world feels too small, with characters never traveling except for off-screen. There's also no real show of friendship, with the most significant examples ending in betrayal. And although there are battles, the heroism is weak. Characters never really seem to be in real danger, and the conflict falls flat against the story's internal lack of logic and meaningful stakes. Only Arondir actually risks himself to save anyone. We kind of forget about him after his part in the story is over. After watching The Rings of Power, I am not inspired, but I'm also not precisely furious. It's worse than I expected, but I did not expect much. I will probably watch season 2 because the show is pretty to look at and it's fun to heckle. The storytelling might also improve now that the prequel to the prequel has been dispensed with, but then again, I had the same hope for the Star Wars movies and ended up feeling like each installment was worse than the last, so I guess we'll see. Although I am disappointed with this show, I can't assuage fans on one point. The Rings of Power, however bad you think it is, will not hurt Tolkien's legacy. The writings of Tolkien exist wholly separately from this production. I've heard people saying that The Rings of Power is like painting over a great piece of artwork, but it's not like that. Amazon didn't paint over anything. They didn't purchase the rights of Tolkien's work and literally rewrite it and republish it with changes. What Amazon Prime did was write and produce corporate fan fiction based in Middle-earth. Fan fiction does not destroy the original story that inspired it, no matter how bad it is. Almost always it amplifies the reach of the original work to new audiences. More people are likely to read the Silmarillion because The Rings of Power came out, or, try to. It's a difficult read. But for those who make it past the ponderous creation myths and into the actual story, well, then you're going to have more people that you can discuss the Silmarillion with. And that's great. That also happened with The Wheel of Time being made into a TV show, and I have to admit, I liked that part of it. In summary, The Rings of Power is going to be remembered as watchable, but not amazing. Some people are going to like it because it visually looks good, is distracting from real-world affairs, and has things they value about fantasy stories. Swords and shields, magical artifacts, an expansive world, and encroaching darkness that must be stopped from destroying everything. In my opinion, though, The Rings of Power fails as an adaptation of Tolkien's Legendarium. The characters and themes are all wrong, and some of the plot points and additions, like Mithril being tied to elven immortality, betray some of Tolkien's most heartfelt values. I also think the story fails on numerous points of logic, and as a production, the world feels too small and too staged. So that's my take. Put in the comments if you agree or disagree. I'm honestly not too fussed about it either way. Also, as a reminder, I am still relatively new to YouTube, and producing content like this is not my day job. If you want me to continue making videos, like and subscribe, because otherwise I have little incentive to write essays on the weekends. Until next time.